punching. Oh, nope, she's sitting down. Thought she was moving to the podium.
Yeah, that's fine.
Hi everyone, my name is Heather. I'm here from the Jefferson-Madison Regional Library, the library downtown. We're excited to be here tonight with author Rachel Beanland and moderator Catherine Herndon. I want to thank everyone for coming out for this special event. Please stay afterward for book signing with Rachel in the exhibition space down the hallway. I would like to thank Michelle and David Baldacci as the premier sponsors of the Virginia Festival of the Book, as well as the Art and Jane Hess Fund of the Library Endowment. I'd also like to recognize the JMRL Friends of the Library and our partner, Virginia Festival of the Book, for making this event possible, as well as our author Rachel and moderator Catherine for taking time to celebrate JMRL's 2024 Same Page Community Read. JMRL works with the Festival of the Book and JMRL Friends of the Library each year to bring a celebrated author to town and distribute free copies of one of their books throughout the JMRL service area. Hopefully many of you received one. JMRL also offers free programs and events at each branch throughout the month of March, which are related to themes presented by the book. This year, the Same Page Community Read features Florence Adler Swims Forever by Rachel Beanland, who uses her own family history to craft a story about how a family and community come together to respond to an unexpected tragedy. We are deeply appreciative and thank the Friends of the Library for supporting the Same Page Community Read for the last 6 years. I hope you will enjoy the conversation tonight, as well as Florence Adler Swims Forever, if you haven't read it yet. Please visit your local JMRL branch and attend some of our amazing programs. Thank you again for your time and support.
Hello, I understand many of you have read the book already, and for those of you who haven't, we'll try not to give away any spoilers in case you'd like to read it. I really enjoyed it, so I hope that you'll have a great time with it. I'm going to jump right in because we only have an hour, and I know you guys will want to ask some questions too. So, if you have not read Florence Adler Swims Forever, spoiler alert, Florence, the title character, dies in the first 11 pages.
It's not a spoiler.
It's not.
We're saying that one's not a spoiler.
I mean, it's 11 pages. And it kind of hints on that, something horrible happens. Well, that's what it is. That happens. So your beginning is so striking, and you have so many really nice images of when Florence is coming out of the water and the red bathing cap, and it's so heartrending because it's from Gus's point of view. I know from your author's note that it's based on some personal family history.
Yeah, of course. So when my grandmother was a little girl, my grandmother grew up in Atlantic City. Both my grandparents on my mother's side grew up in Atlantic City. And when she was a little girl, her aunt was training to swim the English Channel. Her name was Florence Lowenthal. Florence Lowenthal was 20 years old. She was a champion swimmer, very talented young woman. And she went out for a training swim on a hot day in July and stopped swimming out off the coast. And the lifeguards could see her, the Atlantic City Beach Patrol could see her stop swimming. And so they got in the boat and went and retrieved her and brought her back to the shore. And so my grandmother's, one of her earliest memories was, I should say she's dead now, but was watching Florence's body be brought back onto the shore. And she always said there were two things she remembered about that day. She remembered the red bathing cap that Florence Lowenthal was wearing, and she remembered the sounds of her grandmother's wails. The whole family had been at the beach that day. There was one exception, one family member who was not at the beach that day, and that was my great-grandmother, my grandmother's mother. She was pregnant. She had lost a baby the previous summer, and so, she was, the new pregnancy was considered high risk, and so she was in the hospital on bed rest. And the story I always heard was that the family made this decision, really spearheaded by my great-great-grandmother, to not tell my great-grandmother that her sister had died. And they all went in on this secret for what they believed was the good of this unborn baby. And I had just always heard that story. And the women in my family, I think initially when I heard the story, I usually would hear it from my mother. And my grandmother didn't like to talk about it that much when I was young. It was such a horrible event in her life. But initially, I think my mother would tell me the story because it was like I had to wait an hour before I could swim. And I don't know if this is a Jewish family thing or just an everybody family thing or whatever, but it was like very worried, and God forbid you get in that pool if you'd eaten a banana 45 minutes earlier.
Rachel, could you speak more into the mic?
Can you not? Okay, I'll move it closer. Is that better? Okay, so sorry. So, I think initially I would hear these stories from my mother, because she would say, well, you've got to wait an hour, and we had someone in our family who drowned, and, so I knew at an early age that there had been this drowning. But usually the story was told more from the perspective of this great-great-grandmother of mine who would walk into this hospital room and act like everything was okay, who was able to just put on this poker face and pretend to one of her daughters that life was fine when the reality was that she had just buried her sister, right, like the other daughter. And I was always fascinated by the story. I mean, I would ask my mother to tell it again and again. And I think one of the things that struck me, even as a pretty young person, was that the women in my family universally seemed to believe that they had made the right decision in keeping the death a secret. They kind of couldn't believe there was another way that you could have gone about this. To such an extent that when I told my mother I was working on this novel, of course she's like, oh, family secret, like, really? But she was a little bit confused about how there would be enough plot, right? Because she was like, well, like, this isn't a gray area. Like, this is so obvious. Of course you keep the secret. And I was like, I just don't think everyone's on the same page with that, right? But, so anyway, this is all to say that I've always been fascinated by the story. And then, by my mid-30s, when I was ready to bite off, finally, like, writing the novel I'd always wanted to write, this was the subject I came back around to, this story.
So what made you decide to start with killing off Florence? She's still a really well-realized character that I really already care about in the first, 10 pages. I remembered when the book came out that I think I had heard the plot, but then by the time I read it, I had completely forgotten what it was about, and I didn't read the back, and so 10 pages in, I'm like, oh my gosh, she's killing off Florence! That's her title character! So were there ever versions where you had more Florence, or were you always pretty much
I knew she had to go, right? Because the story was always about what this family did after she was dead, right? Like, that was the part that was so interesting. And I was so intrigued by this kind of bigger idea of secret keeping, but secret keeping for people's benefit, because everybody believed that they were doing this for the good of somebody else, right? And so I was very intrigued by that idea. I knew she had to die early because I needed to get to the part where the family was working to keep this secret. I played around a little with like, okay, is she already dead? You know, how long is she going to stay alive, right? And you know, even in a very close to the end, you know, we were still going back and forth, my editor and I, on like, is she just alive for 1 page? Or, you know, I pushed for like 11, you know, I was like, can we have a few more pages with her? But I did know that she had to go pretty soon. In a very early draft, when I wrote the first 150 pages of this book, as part of, I was at Virginia Commonwealth University in their novel writing workshop. It was a 2-semester class. I was working full time and had kids, and you know, I just asked if they'd let me enroll, and they were very generous and let me do it. But I started writing the book there, and my very first submission, you know, it's September, I'm all shiny faced, I'm with all these graduate students who are like, who's she? What's she doing here? And I turned in a 30-page prologue. Just like nobody wants to read a prologue at any point, right? But certainly not a 30-page one. But it was like all these scenes from Florence's swimming career and life, and it was like I was kind of in her head thinking about all this stuff, and everyone was like, why don't you just scatter those throughout the book? Like, people can remember her. Like, and I was like, oh, that's a good point, okay. So, you know, this is the beauty of being in a workshop, right, is that sometimes you get this feedback that stops you before you've gone too far in a direction that you can't come back from.
So talking about the writing of it, you chose to tell the story in 7 different points of view. So can you talk about your writing process for that, as far as maybe who gets to tell what pieces of the story, and did you think at all about capturing different voices for each different person, or what was your process like?
You know, it's funny, people ask me about these 7 characters, and you know, the truth is I came up with the 7 very quickly and very easily. Like, I knew that I was going to use these 7 characters long before I kind of figured out the whole plot of the book, or, you know. And in fact, I went to this writing conference in Vermont. I don't know if anyone in here has been to it, Breadloaf Writers Conference, and it's a wonderful, wonderful conference. And I was there actually working on a nonfiction project that I'd been, you know, toiling at for a number of years, and I had this idea for this novel. At that point, this was 2015, and I remember sitting there and talking to Ann Hood, who was my teacher there, and I said, hey, I have this idea for this novel. Can I write it from 7 points of view? Is that okay, right? And she's like, yeah, do whatever you want. I was like, okay. So I did. I knew early on that I wanted these 7 characters, and I think I had this inclination that the book was going to be heavy, right? Like, I mean, there was no way I could write about this family keeping this secret without it being a book about grief, right? But I had gone through the experience of losing my own father in my 20s, and I'm one of 4 children. And so I did have some inkling that, you know, when a lot of people who are close to each other lose someone, you're not all sad at the exact same second, right? And someone might be having a bad day and someone else is having an okay day. Or you're cracking jokes at the funeral, or, you know, like there are these moments of levity even when you're in the midst of this real, you know, hardship. And so I thought that one way to deal with the fact that I was going to write a whole book set in this period of deep grief would be to have enough characters, you know, and people who are not all as close to Florence as, say, her mother, right?
And not all having the same grief at the same time.
Right, and not all having the same grief at the same time. So that, you know, if you're in a heavy chapter with Esther and you're just like, oh my God, this mother, how can she go on, right? And then the next person you get to is Isaac, and he's like barely mourning, right? Then at least you as the reader get a little bit of a break, you know? And that felt important to me, to give people a break. I think writing the whole book from Esther's perspective, which would have been the natural one, would have been hard.
Right. Esther's the mother of the girl who drowned, so that would be.
Yeah, and she's the one who goes into that hospital room and puts on the smiling face, and and I think that would have been a tough point of view for the whole story.
And it's really interesting too to get to see her sister's point of view of like there's something not quite right.
Right,
but
right.
She can't quite.
So I have the perspective of the sister who's in the hospital room, and she doesn't know what's going on, right? But people are tiptoeing around her, and so
she was already kind of feeling that way before something obviously went wrong, and now she's thinking, what's wrong with my family?
Mm-hmm,
So it was really interesting also to get that perspective, because you're sort of, oh no, is she going to find out? Or wait, maybe I kind of want her to find out?
Right,
So-
right, yeah. And I always knew I would have the perspective of Gussie, of course, the little girl who begins the book, because Gussie is the closest to my grandmother. I mean, she's representing my grandmother, and so so for me that was a really special character, and I felt like I had to open the book with her, and I knew the story because she had told it. I think if she hadn't been on the beach that day, I'm not sure I'd know the story now, because the generation before her were so tight-lipped about this type of thing. I mean, I've talked to family members who said, older family members who said when they used to go to, my great-grandmother's house, or my great-grandmother's house, like, people just did not read a word about Florence or the drowning or it was a different time.
So let's talk about Gussie a little bit, because I love Gussie. She's one of my favorites. So what can Gussie tell us as a point of view character that other people can't tell us?
Gussie, she was fun to write. I like writing children. I mean, I think, children are tough in literature because on one hand, we all as readers know that their brains are not fully developed, right? And so we know they're going to do these unpredictable things, and we just can't fully predict what they might be. So in some ways they can be frustrating characters on the page, but they're also kind of delightful because they will tell you the thing no one else will tell you, right? Or they'll observe the thing that nobody else will observe. And so I had a lot of fun with Gussie, putting her in these situations where, she's observing relationships or, the fracturing of relationships, right, that other people kind of can't see. And also they'll just say the darndest things. I mean, like, I remember when my own father died, my son was 5, and, I just remember sometimes, like, he would say the most insensitive things where it's like, not his fault, he's 5.
Yep.
But you're just like, oh, stop. Like, but so there's some kind of joy and levity in that too.
I definitely think that's true. And I think we understand things through Gussie that Gussie doesn't understand yet. That she
Right,
said something
exactly.
like,
There's this dramatic irony where we know what something means, but she doesn't know what it means, right? Yeah, so they're fun to play with.
So you obviously did a whole lot of research on Atlantic City and the time period, and I have a couple questions about that. What was your research process like for digging up those
Oh my
details?
God. So I have this habit, I've now realized as I work on my 3rd book, of going overboard on the research. I just like it, and I really want it to be very accurate. I had this thing with Florence Adler since forever where I did not want some 100-year-old to read this book and be like, that's not the way Atlantic City was, right? And you could argue that there was like a slim chance this was gonna happen, but actually I got this email from a guy who was 98, and he's like, I saw in your dedication, he's from Atlantic City, he said, I saw in your dedication you dedicated it to Frances Katz. I went to high school with her. And he said, I knew your great-grandfather. And I'm like, great-grandfather? Like my grandfather's father? Or, and he's like, yeah, Walter Hanstein Jr. Or Walter Hanstein, not Jr. And I'm like, huh? He died in like 1938. Like, you knew him? Like, it was just a mind-blowing email. But anyway, he's like, I just read your book. I want you to know you got everything right. So, and we had a nice correspondence. We had a nice correspondence for a couple years, actually. Go back and forth for like maybe 6 months, and then I didn't hear from him for a while, and I got kind of nervous, and because he was 98, and I actually, I'm sorry, I'm going off subject, but it's a funny, enjoyable story. So when he emailed me and said, I'd gotten everything right, and he told me a little bit about his background, I said, I don't think I'm ever going to write a sequel to Florence, Adler, Forever, but if I did, I would write something set in the 40s because, of course, Atlantic City becomes this, they trained a lot of GI soldiers that, the GIs were all like there for training, but then also they turned the hotels into hospitals. And so a lot of wounded soldiers came back to Atlantic City. So, it was kind of interesting in that time period, and it'd be about when Gussie was coming of age. So I said, would you talk on the phone? Like, could we chat a little bit about Atlantic City in the 40s, and I'll just take some notes. And so we had a couple conversations, and he would email me his memories, as he was thinking of stuff. And we just had this like lovely back and forth for a while. And then I stopped hearing from him. And then The House is on Fire came out, and I got an email. And this is 2 years later. And he goes, hey, it's Ed Fields. And he's like, I thought you were going to write a sequel to Florence, Adler, Forever. I've been waiting for it. I'm like, oh my God. Like, well, I was always working on this other book first. Like, it's going to be a hot minute before I do anything with this Florence Adler stuff. And I think he was disappointed because, but anyway, I digress. I know, but so going back to the question of research though, I want Ed Fields to approve of anything that I write about Atlantic City is what I'm basically saying. So, as for research, I start usually by reading a bunch of secondary sources, and so for something like this, I went and read Trudy Adderley biographies, right, to figure out open water swimming and what it was like. Turns out, it's so funny, these things where once you start researching, you fill in all these holes. Like, I always knew that not just in Florence Lowenthal drowned, but she had drowned because she was training to swim the English Channel. Everybody who told the story always talked about her training to swim the English Channel. It was a detail that never got lost in all the generations. And I was fascinated by this detail, but I thought, wow, she must be, but really, that's kind of unique, right? And then, of course, I started doing my research on Trudy Adderley, the first woman to swim the English Channel, and I realized, oh my gosh, of course she wanted to swim the English Channel. In the late 1920s, everybody wanted to swim the English Channel because Trudy Adderley swam it successfully in 1926, and it made headlines. It was the story of the year. She had tried to swim it in 25, she'd been unsuccessful, her coach had tapped her out, and if you get tapped out, you're done. And she went to the papers because she was furious. She thought her coach had kind of unfairly tapped her out. And so by the time she went back in 26, everybody was following her every move. And, reporters, you never know when someone's going to swim the English Channel because they're waiting for the right tides. Has anyone out here swum the English Channel? Just out of curiosity. But, you have to wait for the perfect tide and the perfect, everything. And so every day there would be dispatches to the United States, like, today's not the day, she's not going to swim the channel today, And so as I start reading the papers, and I'm like, oh my God, of course I had this great-great-aunt who wanted to swim the English Channel. Because she drowned really in 1929, 1934 is when I set the book, but so there were pieces like that clicked into place as soon as I started reading secondary sources, right? Atlantic City is a funny place to do research about because, of course, the real Atlantic City as it is today doesn't really have much to do with Atlantic City of 1934. So much has been demolished, right? But then you go on eBay or something, and it's like you can find all this memorabilia because, everybody, who here had a parent who honeymooned in Atlantic City, or, did you vacation in Atlantic City? There's like a whole generation, right, of people who, you either went to Niagara Falls or you went to Atlantic City, and so there was a bunch of memorabilia online. And then you know, sometimes it's like you just need these really specific books. Thank God there's a book on Jewish businesses in Atlantic City that someone thought to write, and thank you, you know, God.
Okay, that's a niche book. Who's
It
going to read
is
that?
Jews in Atlantic City. That's who's going to read it.
Give it to me
It
now.
was published locally in Atlantic City for Jewish people. Yes. But you know, I read memoirs of guys who had been on the Atlantic City Beach Patrol. You know, I mean, I read everything I could get my hands on. And then when I was closer to finishing the book, I went to Atlantic City and dug through the archives at their public library. A shout out to all public libraries. The Atlantic City Public Library, it's called the Atlantic County, I think, Public Library actually, but they have the archives for the Atlantic City Beach Patrol. And I was able to look at a logbook from the Beach Patrol kept in the years in which my great-great-aunt drowned. And they, you know, I could tell which beach tents were out there. You know, they have the beach tents and the beach hospitals and all these like tents at various points. And so I could see exactly which roads that cross-sected with the beach they had tents at. And then they kept a death count. And I could see like the exact, I mean, it didn't have a name, but it was like right there in 1929, like there's her death. Like, it was really pretty incredible. You know, I found her old yearbook. I mean, like not her physical copy, but from her, stuff like that was, I mean, when you do the research, it really does bring it to life.
Were there any cool facts that you really wanted to include that you didn't manage to work in? I thought the thing about the incubators on the boardwalk.
Well, I worked that
That was just amazing. So I was like, is there more of this?
Yeah, you know what I really wanted to include that was not there in 1934, and I'm such a stickler with my historical details that I will not put in something if it was not really there, is the flying horses, like the diving horses. Does anyone remember those from Atlantic City? Yeah, and I also watched the Disney movie as a kid. What was it? Wild Horses Hearts Can't Be Broken, something. And so I couldn't imagine writing this book without putting that in, but I couldn't put it in because the diving horses were taken away. They were deemed too dangerous. Imagine that. I mean, who'd have thought? And then they were briefly brought back, but they were not there in 1934. The other thing that was not around in 1934 was Monopoly. It came out like the next year or something, you know, so I was like, that was a bummer. There were a few things like that where I really, you know, they're kind of Atlantic City touch points,
Right.
but I'm a purist.
So you and I were both involved with James River Writers in Richmond, and the author Robert Goulrick came to our conference one year and told us that he thought writers basically wrote the same book over and over again because there's a continual story that you're retelling or a continual theme that you're trying to get at. Do you feel like there's a theme that you're trying to tell in the 2 books you published and the one you're working on?
You know, the funny thing about that question is that I think I was in the room when he said that. Yeah, I remember him speaking. And of course, I would have been in that room as like a real wannabe writer, like hoping that one day I could publish a book. So, you know, I think when I think about the similarities, because, you know, of course on the surface there's not a lot of similarity between a book set in 1934 Atlantic City and then The House is on Fire, which is about the Richmond Theater fire, which happened in 1811. But I do think they're both books about grief. I think, you know, with Florence Adler Swims Forever, you know, looking at this one family and how they grieved, and what they did in the kind of like aftermath of this devastating event. And with The House is on Fire, I think I was really interested in a community's grief, like in this, how the whole city responded to this, you know, horrific event. And I think to some extent, I mean, you know, my father died young. His death left, you know, of course, an indelible impression on me. I think I'm always interested. I think once you've had that kind of experience, it's like impossible to unhave it, you know?
Right.
So I think that to some extent I'll always be writing about grief, but I think it will take different forms,
Right.
and I definitely I'm not interested in ever writing the same book twice,
Right.
which is why I had to tell poor Ed that I wasn't sure I was going to ever write the sequel to Florence Adler. But, you know, I want to keep challenging myself both in terms of, like, you know, where I set my stories, the time period I set my stories, the point of view, you know, all these things. I want to keep it interesting.
I'm just going to ask, I'm going to ask one more and then open it up to questions, and I've got some more if we have time at the end, but I want you all to have plenty of time to ask questions if you have questions. So we were talking about before, it's been 4 years since the book came out and a little bit longer since you were writing it. What do you most remember about your debut process that was fun or exciting, and then maybe what was the most difficult about it?
Oh my gosh. Well, I mean, how long do you have? I mean,
Never mind, we're not doing questions.
selling your first book is of course tremendously exciting. I actually have a good friend in the audience here, Kristen Green. I don't know if anyone read her books. Something Must Be Done About Prince Edward County, and then she had a more recent one come out. But you know, I had a front seat, I would say, experience watching her sell Something Must Be Done About Prince Edward County, and it was really. It's still, even if you've watched friends go through the process and you've gotten all the tips and tricks and, you know, you think you've got your query letters nailed down and you think your manuscript's great and, you know, everyone's telling you, yeah, this is ready to go, you still don't think it will ever happen. Like, ever. It doesn't matter how many James River Writers conferences I go to. And so, you know, when it happened, like when it was kind of a slow process. Of course, it's never quick. But like, you know, I signed with an agent, and then he went out with it, and Simon & Schuster was interested, and then we went to auction, and it was like this whole big exciting thing, like you see on TV or something. Like, it was crazy, and I just was in shock. You know, like, oh my God, this is really going to happen. Like, I'm going to do this, and of course, I have kids, so I think we found out, you know, the auction closed at noon, and you know, by 12:15 I knew I was going to be published to Simon & Schuster, and you know, my agent had called, and you know, we're all celebrating, my husband and I, and friends came over, and you know, it was like everyone was really excited. And then my son, who was maybe 13 or 14 at the time, gets home from school, and my husband goes, you know, Gabriel, your mom sold her book, and he goes, oh, cool. What's for dinner? So, you know, those kids will keep you really grounded. And so I like to think that this is not, you know, gone to my head at all. But you know, they will definitely not care for you. But then, you know, the book, it was such a crazy process. So it's like everything was going really smoothly. I sold it. It was exciting. And then it was meant to come out in July of 2020. And, you know, of course, in March 2020, we were just starting to plan the book tour, and I was actually on a pre-publication tour, which was super fancy and fun, and we were going to 4 cities with like a bunch of authors that were all publishing with Simon & Schuster that summer, and so we were going to go to Raleigh, New York, Seattle, and San Francisco. And if you remember, Seattle was a bit interesting in the beginning. And we're like at the airport in Boston. We've done the Boston leg, and everyone at Simon & Schuster's like, nope, you're getting back on the planes and going home. You know, like, it's not looking good. And you know, then we were just gonna flatten the curve for 2 weeks, and you know, I thought maybe the book tour's still happening. It's like, no, it's not happening. So that was like a slow realization that, like, oh, this thing that you wanted forever is, I mean, obviously it was like small potatoes compared to everything everyone was going through. But you know, I partnered with like our local bookstore, and we delivered parties in a box to anyone who pre-ordered the book. We couldn't have a launch party, so I broke ABC laws and delivered Prosecco to people. You know, like, whatever. Yeah, it was a different time.
Out of your truck.
Right. But yeah, so it, you know, you made do with it was fun. In some ways, I book reached more people, you know, because we figured out Zoom. Thank God by July we figured it out, right? And so book clubs, like I met with tons of book clubs, and book clubs, I mean, as you all know if you were in one, like they were going great guns at this time frame. And yeah, so I think a lot of people discovered the book anyway. I feel really terrible for the writers who had books come out in like March, April of 2020, you know, because we didn't know what was up, you know, then. But by July, we kind of figured it out. So yeah, but when The House is on Fire came out, it was all new to me. Like, oh, I get to get on planes and go places. Okay.
In a bookstore? And
Yeah, it was weird.
Look at these people.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm going to open it up for questions from you all if you have questions. I see one right there.
Rachel, why did you decide to set the book in 1934 instead of 1929?
Yeah.
Just when you want to repeat.
Yeah, I'll repeat. Yeah. So she asked why I wanted to set the book in 1934 instead of 1929. The main reason initially, before I had kind of figured out the Anna storyline completely, was that I was scared. Initially, I thought I might go through the High Holy Days with the book, and I was nervous that I was going to come up against the stock market crash. And I didn't want to in any way touch the stock market crash, like of 29. So I very much wanted to stay away from that. So I would have picked any year other than that one. And then of course I ended up ending the book in August, and it wouldn't have mattered anyway. But I also think kind of in 1929, that still would have been hanging over people's heads as readers, where they would have been like, well, Joseph's doing okay now, but give him a couple months and it's gonna be rough. So I did definitely want to get out of 29. And then, of course, you know, as Anna's storyline developed, and thinking about what was happening, you know, in Europe, I wanted to find the right year when it would have made sense for a student to be coming over still, you know, where some of the laws were tightening down, you know, the Third Reich was in power, but yet it was still kind of, you were in that no man's land where it was unclear whether people should immigrate or not, and whether the United States would take them if they could go.
And more questions? We've got a mic coming around, so.
I'm curious about your choice of your topics being historical topics. Have you considered or contemplated writing about our current times? And I'm sure there's different challenges in doing a historical novel versus a contemporary novel, but I'm curious about your thought process in that.
Yeah. You know, it's funny because sometimes, like, in fact, at this, you know, on Saturday, I'm going to be on the panel about historical fiction, you know, and I sometimes still am surprised by that, where I'm like, oh, do I count? I'm historical fiction, and I guess, yeah, like I've written 2 books that are historical, but I don't think of myself as being like a historical fiction writer. I just, even after all that research, I know, I still think of myself as being like a writer, and I'm interested in telling good stories, and the 2 that I've published happen to be stories that needed to be set in the past. When I initially set out to write Florence Adler's Homes Forever, I wasn't sure I would set it in the past. You know, I kind of played with it initially in my head as like, is this something I could set in contemporary times? And of course I very quickly realized, like, no, I could not keep a death a secret for 5 seconds in contemporary times. And so I knew I had to go back, you know, back in time and go, you know, be approximately at the time period that it had really happened. So that one I kind of ended up writing historical by default. And then, you know, The House is on Fire, it's funny, I was actually working on something contemporary when, before I began The House is on Fire. And then the pandemic happened. And, you know, it was a project that was going to require a lot of research but a lot of travel. And so when the planes, you know, were all grounded and we weren't going anywhere, I started to panic, and I live in Richmond. And so, you know, I start thinking, well, what could I do? What could I do where I can walk to everything I need? And The House is on Fire was kind of the product of that exercise, me saying, well, you know, I could write something about the Richmond Theater fire, which happened in my backyard, you know. So it's almost, I think, kind of a happy accident at this point that I've written 2 books that are historical. There's a lot I really enjoy about writing the historical fiction in terms of, I do like the research, but what I find is that when I'm writing contemporary things or things that are closer to the present, you really have to do as much research. If you want to do it well, you know, you've got to do the research anyway. The book I'm writing right now is set in the 1970s, so, you know, some of you will think of it as historical. And you know, I'm doing every bit as much research for that as I did for 1811. It's just, you know, different sources, and actually it's funny with that one, I've been doing more interviews because I can call people up, thank God, and say, what was it like? So, you know, I think I fully expected that at some point soon I will write something that is truly set in contemporary times. I'm not, I have to say, I'm not looking forward to dealing with cell phones and texting. I always find it a little irritating to read it in books, you know, when you get to the point where characters are doing a lot of texting. But it is the way we live, like, you know, so you've got to kind of figure out as an artist.
Secrets or
yeah.
people keeping information from each other. Like
I
you said,
know.
Could you keep it at the secret
I
for
know.
5 seconds?
Well, you know, my family, we always make fun of the show Parenthood. Did anyone watch that? We loved that show. And we loved it because we're a family with 4 kids, and, you know, they've got their 4, and but we always used to laugh because they're always popping by each other's houses, which as a writer, you want to do that because you want to put people and scenes together. So I understand the urge in a writer's room to be like, oh, well, he'll just pop by her house and talk to her, right? But of course the reality is we just text each other, and my, you know, siblings and I are on a group thread, and that's about it. So there are unique challenges, I think, with writing, you know, contemporary novels, but.
Do you have another question?
So when Isaac takes Gussie to see his dad, the dad says a piece of what I assume is Yiddish that is a greeting maybe, and I could not find it. I looked it up. It's Onaganim Ibarashin.
Unfortunately for you, I don't remember either. I mean, I wrote it 6 years ago, 7 years ago, 8 years ago. I don't know. I mean, definitely not. I mean, I could go back in my notes. You want to give me your email? Okay. I'll try to find out. But I mean, somewhere I must know, right? Yeah. No.
And it's not Russian.
Oh, she's asking you to repeat the words because.
As best as I can. Onaganim Ibarashin. O-N-G-E-N-E-M-I-B-E-R-R-A-S-H-N.
All right, we'll all put our heads together afterwards and try to figure it out.
Did you have
Group thing. We're gonna all get to the bottom of it by the end of this program.
who did you have help from getting the words right, or the?
For my Hebrew and like Jewish stuff, I mean, I'm Jewish and I was raised pretty reform. But I have a good friend who's a rabbi who you know, read the whole book and made sure
You're gonna have to go back to it.
I know, Andrew, what did I mean when I said that? I don't remember. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you call it a question, but I love this part of the book where you said, there's nothing better than that moment at a book club when the room erupts in conversation and everyone's so excited about the book that they're talking over one another. And I'm in a book group, but the reason I read your book is because it's our community read. And tonight my book group's meeting now, but I went to another book group during the day, and we had this amazing conversation about we only as good as our secret. So are we only as good as our secrets, or are we only as sick as our secrets? And so it was just so, the conversation was amazing with this idea of secrets. And there's been a lot of secrets in my family. And I even think I'm part Jewish. And I never even knew it.
You know, it's funny, I've done all these book clubs, and the Irish Catholic book clubs are also like, yeah, this is us too. Like,
Yeah.
there's similarities.
Yeah, it is. And I think the beautiful part during the conversation is there's good and bad that comes from secrets. But I was a little fascinated with Isaac, and I did have a really hard time with that character until I read he wasn't really real. And that really helped me. And I also thought, what would the story have been like if there hadn't been that big secret and the family actually had mourned together Florence's death? And they weren't trying to hide things from each other, and they were trying to support each other, because I almost couldn't read the book because Florence died in the first 11 pages, and I was grieving through the whole book. I couldn't even believe it when the person said, well, it was only 4 months. And I was like, oh my God, it seemed like 10 years.
I mean, you really do a good job of getting us attached to Florence.
Oh,
and I'm very
I'm glad.
Anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, I've done all these book clubs, and I will say that lots of people will tell me in book clubs, you know, I identified with this because in my family, what we kept from so-and-so, I feel like I'm walking around with like 100 people's secrets, you know, where I'm like, I don't know who they are anymore, but I know what they didn't tell Great Aunt Gerda or whatever, you know.
It's 100 more books you have.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Hi, I was curious, in the real life, what happened to the sister that was being protected and her baby? How did that turn out with keeping the secret?
Well, okay, so I have to be careful with that because I don't want to give too much away. Remember, Isaac's not real, right? So things get better. You know, I mean, that's one thing solved, you know? I don't know if should I say more?
Are you asking if the baby was okay?
Yeah, I can't give too much away.
But
We'll talk offline. Come see me in this book signing line.
in real life.
Yeah, I feel like if I tell you what happened in real life, then maybe I'll spoil some things. So I'm gonna hold off, but we'll talk in the signing line.
So if I ask a question that is also a spoiler, can I not ask my question?
No, I'm not you be the arbiter. I'm not gonna be the, yeah.
They kind of wanted us to not spoil the ending just in case there were people
Okay.
here intrigued and who want to go read it.
She's passing back the mic.
As you should be.
Come see me in the signing line too.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll
She's going to
whisper.
sign books and you can whisper to her
We'll whisper.
your spoilery questions.
Oh, it's back there.
I know you said this was the book that you had sort of always meant to write, and so it was your first one, but was there any sort of intimidation of tackling that story you've been holding on to for so long on your sort of first try at a novel?
I should have been intimidated. I mean, like, you know, after the fact, people have told me like, wow, 7 points of view for your first novel, huh? And I'm like, I didn't think it through. Like, you know, I wasn't thinking like, oh, would have probably been easier to do a single point of view for my first novel. So there were certain like kind of choices I made because I just didn't know any better, right? And in hindsight, like, yeah, absolutely, I should have made my life easier.
I mean, it wouldn't have been easier because you would have had to spend the whole time with Esther and that would have been really sad and hard.
Right, and I might not have finished the book, or, yeah, so, no, I think I did kind of luck into some things. I was intimidated. I mean, I was intimidated when I started writing the book. My grandmother was still alive. So, you know, and I called her and I was like, I'm I'm writing a family drama set in Atlantic City. You know, where did you used to swim in the pool? And of course, like, I didn't think I was gonna get published. I was like working on a Word document, you know, but I just was like not brave enough to tell
I'm
her.
gonna turn something in for school. Like,
Yeah, could you just tell me where you swam? But you know, I wasn't quite brave enough to tell her what I was up to. And then my mother did finally tell her. But you know, then my mother, I was even like nervous to talk to my mom about it because, you know, my mom is really sweet. I mean, she like really believes in me, which is lovely when you have a mother who believes in you. And so I would say, you know, well, Mom, I'm working on this Word document here, and like, you know, people are telling me they like it, and I think I might try to sell it, and you know, and she's like, she believed it was going to be a book, you know, which was great on one hand, but then on the other, she was like, well, wait a second, you're gonna publish a book in which you're telling the secret that we all kept secret on purpose, right? And you know, I had to really convey to her that what I was writing was fiction. You know, that yes, I was using like the kernel of this story, but there was so much that I didn't know about it, you know, because I didn't know these people, like with the exception of Gussie, who's a small child, right? I knew my grandmother as an adult. But all of these generations before, for me, they were fictional people. And so I think I was bold enough to do it partly because I didn't know them, you know? And then if I'd even been one generation closer, I would have been truly terrified, right? But even as I gave the book to my mother, you know, I had to kind of say, Mom, like, it really is fiction. Like, please read it as fiction, right?
Was there any pushback on that from your family?
No, I think, you know, by the time even by the time she was reading a good draft, right? At that point, my professor at VCU was really excited about the book. I had an agent excited about the book. Like, there was enough excitement that she also was really excited for me. And I think she trusted me to write a good story. And you know, she said that when she read the book, it took her, I think, about 2/3 of the way through before she let go of the fact that this was not her family. You know, she said initially she expected Joseph to act exactly the way her grandfather would have acted, or you know,
Yeah.
and then she, or great grandfather. And then, you know, eventually over time, she realized, like, oh no, they're not going to do the same things. They're not the same people, right? So then she was excited. She got swept up in it. And by the time the book published, unfortunately, both my grandparents were gone, and so I hate that they didn't see how it turned out because it would have been so fun. I think. Yeah.
I think we probably have time for one more question if we have. Maybe two.
First, I just want to give a plug. I really loved your most recent book, The House is on Fire.
Thank you.
If you guys haven't read it, it's the library copy. So.
We'll be able to buy those after.
Then I just wanted to ask you a little bit more. You were talking about an agent and that you published with Simon Schuster. I know there's a lot of talk now with self-publishing. I'd love to hear how you went about your publishing process and why you chose that versus alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, you know, for me, I was really hoping to do this as a career. You know, I was working in PR. I'd gone into PR particularly, you know, because I love to write, but I needed a paycheck and health insurance, and so I was always thinking about ways that I could, you know, like bring these two parts of my life together. Like, how could I write the things I want to write and also have health insurance, right? And I'll be honest, I get my health insurance through my husband. Just full disclosure. But you know, that's the idea, okay? So, so that was always my goal. So, you know, going the traditional publishing route is a better way to ensure that you will have health insurance one day. And that for me was always the primary goal. So, you know, I will say, especially writing your first book, like, when you get that first book deal, you're so excited because you would have paid someone to publish the book. Like, this is your baby that you've walked around with, and it's been a Word document, and nobody knew or cared that you were working on it. And you're just so jazzed that somebody cares. That if they had been like, now write us a check, you'd be like, okay. But instead, they're writing you a check, and so it's awesome, right? Like, it's doubly awesome. And then the novelty like wears off, and then you kind of expect to be written checks. But yeah, the beginning, you know, I don't know a lot about self-publishing because I didn't go that route, and I didn't really spend a lot of time investigating. But it's a slog no matter which way you do it. I mean, and there's always this aspect of, you know, giving up a little creative control, and like suddenly you're thinking about a market, who will read the words you write, right? But I almost think you have to just like block that out of your head completely when you're writing, and you just got to write the story that you love and that is the thing that you have to put down on paper, and then you worry about where it will live.
One more.
I just have to say, having read some self-published books, it really helps that you were working in writers' workshops and getting feedback and things like that. If people don't do that, sometimes that is not a success.
Everyone needs editing.
Yeah, everyone does. My editor's brilliant. I've had the same editor for both books, and she's just a wonderful human.
Okay, I think that's about it. Rachel is gonna be over here in the gallery signing books.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you for reading. This has been so fun.
You can purchase books over here to your left, and Rachel will be over there to the right. Please don't mob Rachel until she gets to the signing table.